Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. My name is Emerson Brooking. I'm a resident senior fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab of the Atlantic Council, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's discussion, the third in the Atlantic Council's After the Insurrection series, exploring the aftermath of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Previous events in this series have considered the future of domestic terrorism and domestic extremist sympathies in the U.S. military and law enforcement. Today's event focuses on deplatforming, the removal of users from social media platforms who use their power to incite violence, harassment, and real-world harms. We'll consider the history and impact of deplatforming, as well as legal and free speech concerns. We'll also consider both domestic and international perspectives. I wanted to take a second to reflect on how new this deplatforming discussion really is. 10 years ago, it was still a fairly common argument among tech executives that no speech should be removed from platforms. As long as you didn't break US federal law, and especially if you didn't break copyright law, you could basically say whatever you wanted. It's taken many tragedies to change this. Years of internet-enabled terror attacks by al-Qaeda, the rise of al-Shabaab in Kenya, and the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, a rising tide of white nationalist extremism embodied by terror attacks in Oslo and Utøya, Norway, in Charleston's Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, in the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, and in the Al-Noor Mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. Amid all this, in the United States, we've seen a sharp increase in spectacular street violence and militia activity. Around the world, we've seen growing use of targeted harassment to silence critics of authoritarian governments, especially against women and religious and ethnic minorities. And so the deplatforming discussion is in a very different place today. It is not uncommon to remove tens of thousands of social media accounts at a time, as Facebook and Twitter did against the QAnon movement in the immediate aftermath of January 6th. It may soon be more common to remove world leaders, as Facebook and Twitter also did after January 6th against President Trump, a decision that the Facebook Oversight Board just sustained. And after a 2-year delay, the Biden administration has joined dozens of other nations in supporting the Christchurch call, committing to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online while respecting freedom of expression. We're here today to discuss all of this and to consider where things go next. I'm very pleased to introduce Mike Wenley, editor of BBC Trending and author of Alt-Right, From 4chan to the White House, to kick off and moderate today's discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Emerson. That was a really good summation of the issues that we're going to really delve into. Let me, without further ado, introduce our panelists, who I think, when it comes to these issues, we have a very, very excellent lineup for you today. J.M. Berger is currently a PhD candidate studying extremist ideologies at Swansea University, and he's a research fellow with VoxPol. He's an author. Some of you may know his books, Optimal and Extremism. His work encompasses extremism, terrorism, propaganda, and social media analytical techniques. He studied all manner of extremist groups, the far right, but also Islamist extremist groups. He's written for The Atlantic and Politico. He consults for social media and security companies and government agencies, and he's authored several groundbreaking studies on social media analysis, including the development of metrics for measuring influence, community detection, and detecting the use of manipulative tactics online. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about those manipulative tactics and how they sort of play into this debate. We also have Jenny Domino. Jenny's an associate legal advisor for the International Commission of Jurists. That's a human rights group working to promote human rights and the rule of law around the world. Jenny leads the ICJ's program on internet freedom in Asia Pacific, and she's currently a senior lecturer in law at the University of the Philippines. Now, until recently, she was the ICJ's legal advisor based in Myanmar, where she worked on minority rights, freedom of expression, and international accountability. Of course, these issues are not only issues in the United States or here where I am in London, but in places like Myanmar, where leaders are taken off of social media accounts very frequently. She's written and spoken on a wide variety of topics, and she was also a resource person on the international criminal law at the height of the Philippine drug war in 2017. Jared Holt is a resident fellow at the Digital Forensic Research Lab. He's a journalist and researcher covering political extremism. Many of you will be familiar with his bylines in the Washington Post, Huffington Post, Columbia Journalism Review, many other places. He's a disinformation and conspiracy expert. He studies online right-wing organizing and how all those topics intersect. And prior to joining the DFR lab, Jared works as an investigative reporter at Right Wing Watch, where he covered right-wing extremist movements. Recently, a lot of his work has been focused on the Capitol attack and the proliferation of extremist content online surrounding the events. So we're glad to have his perspective here today. And Emma Lanso is director of the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. That's a not-for-profit based in Washington and Brussels that works to promote democracy through influencing policy with a focus on individual rights. Emma leads the center's legislative advocacy and amicus activity. Her work is focused on protecting fundamental rights to freedom of expression online. And she works to develop content policy best practices. She's a member of the Freedom Online Coalition Advisory Network, the Christchurch Call Advisory Network, and has served on the board of the Global Network Initiative. I want to start with the news of the moment, really, that combines a lot of these issues. Last week, as Emerson mentioned, Facebook's oversight board ruled that the company could continue to keep Donald Trump off their platform. It did criticize the indefinite nature of the ban for the former president and ordered the company to review its decision within 6 months. The board said this decision was indeterminate and standardless, which I thought was interesting terminology. I want to just come out and get your opinions about this. Was it the right call to keep the former president off of Facebook? And I'd like to go to Emma first, because Emma, I think with your sort of background, you may have a very interesting take on this.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this really important discussion. So on this question of former President Trump's Facebook account, in our comments to the Oversight Board, CDT emphasized a couple of key issues. One is that, on the one hand, account deactivation is a really significant penalty. The Facebook Oversight Board tries to bring an international human rights law lens to the decisions it makes. And if you apply international human rights law standards to the question of account deactivation, you're very likely to determine that it's what's called a prior restraint on speech. It's a decision that someone not only can be punished for what they have said, but they have to be prevented from ever speaking again. That's a really serious penalty. And when we're talking about governments and judges enforcing that penalty on individuals for where they might speak anywhere in public, that would be, completely inconsistent with international human rights law. It would be a disproportionate remedy. On the other hand, on online services decide to shut down accounts every day. There are any number of reasons why an online service might decide to shut down someone's account, whether they've been issuing a lot of spam or malware, whether they've been trying to sell fraudulent products or goods, whether they're a repeat offender of the site's content policies. So it's, I think, really important to understand both the potential severity of something like account deactivation, but also to understand how crucial the tool of account deactivation is for a site that's trying to enforce its policies and ensure that the service remains something that other users actually want to come to and use.
Jared, I'd like to go to you next. What's your take on that decision?
I think it was the right one. Keeping Trump off Facebook, at least for the time being, upholding that ban, I think is a net positive. Especially given the fact that the former president hasn't shown any indications of letting up the various lies and disinformation that he was spreading around the election. But I also do, worry about, I have the same concerns that Emma spoke to about like a permanent ban. If Trump is willing to change his behaviors and follow the rules, I think it's fair game for Facebook to reconsider. But, even though he is a world leader, he is a user of a service. The fact is Facebook is not a government, so he has to play by the ground rules of that service. Especially after the attack on the Capitol, I think removing Trump did have sort of a dampening effect on any sort of second wave of organizing that might have taken place. As we look back on January 6th, and our research has shown, a lot of this was driven and centered on the type of rhetoric and messages that Trump was spreading on social media. So I think it's very hard to discount the role that was playing in getting the ball moving.
Yeah, I mean, it struck me in the decision that there was this sort of dance that the oversight board, which of course is very, very new, is trying to do, and we all are trying to sort of figure these things out. Jenny, what's your perspective on all this?
I was muted, sorry. So I think I have 2 points. And first is on the proportionality of the response in assessing what is a proportionate response. I think I echo Emma and Jared's points on deactivation, but I also think that we have to consider that proportionality is now being applied by platforms in relation to state actor speech. And that might trigger a different assessment altogether versus a platform seeking to regulate or deactivate a user that is considered a rights holder or an ordinary citizen. And the second is related to the first, which is it all depends on the context, in my view. So in considering the indefinite nature of the ban, as well as how long the duration of that ban should be, I think it depends when the platform is acting on a specific content. And I think this is the point of the oversight board asking Facebook to clarify this policy and the process behind it. But again, we also have to consider how speech contexts vary in different parts of the world. So another important thing to consider is how broad of a context should these platforms consider? How further back in time should they look at in assessing the political situation in which speech goes viral in a particular context? And here I am talking particularly about Myanmar, where there is a lack of rule of law, where the Myanmar military has committed serious human rights violations for decades, and all of this is widely documented by the United Nations.
I want to come back to that point. It's a very, very important point. Before I do, can I just go to JM and get your thoughts on the question of Trump? Particularly sort of putting it in context of other, potentially violent speech that we've seen from a number of different groups, from a number of different perspectives. I know you've been studying that for quite a while.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and it's great to be here with all these smart people. I think a lot of what's been said already gets to a lot of these points. There are 2 things I think are worth talking about in a little more detail. The first is proportionality. One of the things that's very difficult to assess in this space is proportionality. We can talk about the proportionality of the punishment in terms of a temporary or permanent removal from platform, but it's much harder to assess the proportionality of the harm that leaving somebody like Trump on the platform causes. And there's a lot of subjectivity and a lot of lack of clarity, one problem that we have in this area is that we can't really assess the impact of his removal until he's removed. These are all kind of evolving questions. Social media is a evolutionary platform in the sense that it is constantly evolving, and the things that we assumed 2 or 3 years ago aren't necessarily true today. The second piece is I wanted to just mention on the indefinite nature of Trump's suspension. I think in my reading, and I may be wrong about this, but in my reading of the Oversight Board's comment, the objection to the indefinite suspension was not so much that it was indefinite as that an indefinite suspension is not encoded into Facebook policy in any way. So what the Oversight Board was calling for, and something that I like to call for frequently, is for these companies to have standards and then enforce standards consistently. And that, in many ways, a lot of the debates we have around this center around the fact that Facebook and all the other major social media companies have a PR-driven policy machine in which they wait until they're getting a large volume of bad headlines, and then they try and do something to make the headlines go away, and that's their policy, and that's not a very good basis for policy. So
yeah, it could be said that, despite being around for a decade or more, a lot of social media companies could be accused of still trying to make this stuff up as they go along. It's very interesting. There's a lot of decisions made in the heat of the moment. Arguably, COVID is another good example of this, where sort of COVID policy around health has been made on the fly, and the rules have changed. In fact, we just learned of another policy change that we've reported on today. Go to the BBC website. I'll end my plug now. I wanted to go back to another sort of hot issue, Jenny and Myanmar, because obviously, Trump is not the only world leader to have been booted off of Facebook. Could you, well, first of all, give us the scale, because I believe there's been a number of leaders of the military junta that have been kicked off of Facebook, and is this a proportionate response, in your opinion, to what is an extremely volatile and violent and dangerous situation?
Quite coincidentally, I should say that just an hour ago, my piece on just security on precisely this topic has just been published. So I talk about the history of deplatforming in Myanmar, starting from 2018 when they deplatformed Senior General Min Aung Hlaing. That person, that senior general, is now the head of the military junta that has committed atrocities in relation to the coup that is currently still happening. To answer your question, it's really interesting to compare these two cases. They're very different. Obviously, the two political contexts are very different, but they happen. The proximity of those two events make it interesting, and the corresponding response by Facebook. And in Myanmar, the coup was actually staged by the military because it alleged voter fraud, electoral fraud, in the November 2020 elections. So it's exactly like in the US. The key difference, I would say, is that in Myanmar, democracy was overthrown by the junta, and now the people are fighting back quite valiantly. And there are so many locals and people from Myanmar who could speak more competently than me with respect to how the people of Myanmar have pushed back and are still continuing to push back. But I just want to focus my intervention here on the deplatforming. So first is that the deplatforming in Myanmar happened in 2018. As I mentioned, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, at that time, he was the commander-in-chief of the Myanmar Armed Forces. Facebook did not state any specific community content policy or community standard presumably violated that would merit that response. It referred to the United Nations fact-finding mission on Myanmar report that was released in 2018, finding that Facebook was dominant in Myanmar. It was used by military officials, but also civilian government officials in spreading hate speech against Myanmar's ethnic Rohingya. But it did not also say that Facebook did not also attribute explicitly its decision to deplatform Min Aung Hlaing based on the FFM, the fact-finding mission report. Now, June 2020, some military accounts popped up on the platform. I wrote about this last year when the page was set up. There's the Tatmadaw True News information page, and according to the military spokesperson at that time, and now the military junta spokesperson, Zhao Mintun, the page was set up in order to correct or in order to provide accurate news ahead of the elections, ahead of the November 2020 elections in Myanmar. And Zhao Mintun was also allowed on the platform at that time. He created an account. Now the question is, why were these pages and accounts allowed back on the platform? The problem can be traced back to 2018, precisely because Facebook did not explain why the specific reason and process and the standards that were applied to deplatform those generals, including Min Aung Hlaing. And so now you have a very inconsistent and unwieldy process by which you see select military accounts appearing on the platform, and then while others are still correctly banned. And so now this Tatmadaw True News information page was, now I'm going to talk about the coup that happened on February 1st. It was only 10 days after February 1 that Facebook announced that it would significantly reduce the distribution of content emanating from these military accounts, emanating from the remaining military accounts on the platform. It was only in the third week of the coup, on February 24, that Facebook decided to ban the military indefinitely. So for the first time, it also used the word indefinitely, and I'm assuming this follows from the Trump deplatforming that it used with respect to the Jan 6 insurrection. However, Facebook also said that despite banning remaining military accounts and pages, it would nonetheless retain at least 23 pages and accounts operated and or controlled by the military, without specifying what these pages are, what these accounts are. So with respect to these at least 23 other pages, Facebook would just significantly reduce the distribution of content emanating from these pages. And so, as you can see, I will leave it up to you whether you think these responses are sufficient. And I agree with Mr. Berger that proportionality is very hard to assess. It's easier to say when platforms get it wrong than to say when platforms get it right. But in the context of Myanmar, and again, this is why I was highlighting context at the very beginning. Again, in the context of Myanmar, you can see how Facebook's responses, especially when you compare it to Facebook's response to the Jan 6 insurrection, really pales in comparison. And so I hope that the Trump deplatforming can also broaden this conversation on deplatforming, especially in illiberal regimes.
I think you put your finger on something that frustrates a lot of journalists, me and my colleagues, about the transparency involved, really, the decision-making process. I know that all of the major social media companies have tried to become more transparent, but it's arguable about how successful they've been. I mean, I want to turn now to sort of the, I guess, the question of moral hazard and other potential arguments against actually removing people as dangerous or insurrectionary as they might be from platforms. Because I think we can probably largely agree that removing accounts from the main social networks decreases the influence of people who behind those accounts, right? It's not an easy thing to recover if you've been booted off of YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, your audience. But that says there are definite and clear and good arguments against taking accounts down. It drives people underground. It makes tracking extremists more difficult. It allows them to claim the moral high ground, and it can inspire backlashes. And that's aside from simply the idea of free speech, which we all cherish, and whether removing access to these big platforms is actually sort of it goes along with those values that we have. I'd like to turn to Emma now, and I'm just wondering, from your work, which of those counter arguments or other ones do you find most compelling? What are good reasons to not deplatform people?
No, well, I think you hit on a lot of them in that question, Mike, that there are a lot of concerns about driving people underground or to smaller platforms or to closed messaging systems where they might become kind of further radicalized or only exposed to extremist views as opposed to exposed to counter narratives on a more public and open platform. There are also concerns about kind of limiting the visibility that law enforcement or intelligence agencies have into the kind of activity on these services. And then, of course, there are, I think, a lot of the concerns I focus on day to day, though, are about the sort of line drawing that taking these actions against content and accounts really makes these companies do. They are having to decide, sometimes in reference to lists from the United Nations or from the United States or other governments, who counts as a terrorist, who is a dangerous extremist. And they get those decisions wrong sometimes. They also have only kind of one view into what a person is engaged in. They typically are only really seeing the content that person posts on their service. Whether that content actually really indicates that this person is so dedicated to committing terrorist violence that they ought to be taken down, or they're just posting a lot of really hyperbolic, including language using violence and violent imagery to express an opinion, but they're not actually at risk of committing violence. That can be hard to tell from the company's side. So when there's this push to sort of have a zero tolerance policy or to get companies to make really hard and fast decisions about what is unacceptable kind of expression of extremist views, the end result is we see really broad approaches from companies that also end up sweeping in things like journalism reporting on terrorist activity, or human rights advocates documenting terrorist activity, potentially for future use in court cases. The universe of content that gets swept up can be really, really broad.
I'm wondering with the challenges, whether you think that there can be a universal policy, you know what I mean, that can go across countries, that can go from Silicon Valley and actually be applicable in countries around the world. Is that even possible?
So personally, I think it's pretty difficult because we don't have global agreement even at the United Nations about who is and is not a terrorist or a violent extremist. There is not really one standard that can easily apply in all of these different contexts around the world. So I think there's important and useful guidance from international human rights law standards about more specific things like what amounts to incitement to violence or incitement to discrimination, what counts as propaganda for war, things that are really really looking at the content and the subject matter of what is being said, rather than how do we kind of agree on a labeling of particular groups or organizations as terrorists. There is some international consensus on some, but there's no one standard or agreed definition that everyone, I think, is happy to buy into.
JM, you have looked at this from a number of different perspectives in terms of the groups that have been deplatformed. The popular story is that Islamic State was huge on Twitter, but other platforms as well, and it was reactive, but it took a sort of a concentrated pushback, and that was actually successful. I'm wondering, whether you think that broad narrative was correct, whether there are other comparable storylines that you can see in tackling the far right in the US and elsewhere.
So I think that storyline is correct. I think that it took a while to get everybody lined up behind taking out Islamic State, which was really kind of illustrates how difficult this problem is, because Islamic State was an organization that everyone agreed was, unbelievably evil, and an organization that had no political constituency to step up for it, defend it in any way. So in many ways, it was the easiest possible decision was to take those guys off of the internet, and people still pushed back with a lot of the same arguments that you just raised. So, there's a few things that we can say about those arguments. I mean, the first one, visibility, and whether law enforcement can monitor these groups and whether we're driving them underground. what I would say is we want these groups to be underground. We we could get a lot of visibility on any kind of criminal activity if we just let them do whatever they want. The point is that they should be underground, and that they should not be goose-stepping down the streets of DC, but that they should be, hiding out in corners and not able to get an audience. If that's a little more work for people in law enforcement and people like me who study these groups online, then that's okay. That seems like a reasonable trade-off to me. Where I think that the problem is much more pronounced is what Ms. Lanza was talking about, is really the line drawing is the huge challenging issue here. And my doctoral research is on definitions of extremism, and I have an entire chapter devoted to how different entities around the world and academics and scholars define extremism. And the vast majority of definitions that are in use today are in the service of power in one way or another. So, in some places, such as China and Russia, the definition of extremism is that you oppose the state, which I think we can all see the problem with that. But the majority of definitions in the academic literature that I reviewed defined extremism as being fringe activity, being on the edges of society, on the edges of acceptable social middle. And that is a way of privileging power that is more subtle and insidious. It raises a lot of questions that these authors usually don't have to grapple with, because this is, the definition of extremism is usually a throwaway line in any one of these publications. Throw it out there and then move on. But, if the definition of extremism is that it's outside of the mainstream, then are Mormons extremists? Are Buddhists living in the United States extremists? How do you frame it? Do you frame, the center of society on a local level? Do you national level, on a global level? And that gets into the question of universality that we were just talking about. And, can you have a universal definition of extremism that travels across these borders? And so, I argue in my book and in other publications that you can. I'm building that argument that there are ways to define extremism that aren't dependent on that. But the practical reality is that all of these definitions and all the entities that are doing the defining are extremely motivated in their reasoning for doing so. And so it is correct and right to be skeptical of what they do and to challenge it and to challenge them to do better at every opportunity.
Jared, I'd like to turn to you now. As somebody who's looked at groups, particularly the far right, in the United States, over the last 5 to 6 years, all the sort of ups and downs and, sort of spikes in popularity and deplatforming that has happened with various individuals and groups. Can you point to places where social media companies may have gotten it right, even if perhaps a little bit too late? And were there any examples where they got it wrong, where they perhaps made the wrong call on taking somebody off of their networks?
Yeah, so something I would point to as an example of, this done correctly would be how Facebook reacted to militia groups on its website prior to the election. There was a lot of sort of broader civil rights fears that militia groups and other armed individuals would organize and gather at polling locations, believing that they were going to defend, quote unquote, voting somehow, and that would in turn intimidate voters away and actively create a situation of voter suppression. So, maybe it was a coincidence in the timing, but Facebook, a month or two prior to the election, did what was a pretty comprehensive sweep of militia groups on its platform. They didn't get everything and have, since gone through a few different rounds of trying to clean it up. But I think that's like a really great example of something that should not be on the platform, which is groups organizing often illegally, training and concentrating, the ability to inflict bodily harm and doing so with violent ideologies in the mix. So that's something that I think they did well. Something I don't think they did well was QAnon, and a lot of platforms, really dropped the ball on this one. by the time they got to QAnon, it was very reactive, as we've already discussed. It can often feel on social media, where I think JM said something to the effect of, it seems like the PR shop is making the policy at any given moment. So it's, it kind of felt like a PR reaction to QAnon, but by the time they wound up getting to it, like the first few waves that they hit it with, didn't really move the needle. And it wasn't until after the insurrection on January 6th that the platforms actually stepped up and like really wiped the ideology off of the platforms. So the reason I say that this was an example of it done wrong is because it was frankly so sloppy. They promised this action, did not follow through on this action. And in that wake, they were able to, the QAnon believers and communities organizers were able to sort of walk around different rules and chin up the kind of disinformation that animated people to go to DC on January 6th. So, it was like too little, too late. And then sort of the final blow to a lot of these sources of QAnon misinformation, I think, may have inadvertently shown platforms' hands and like how effective they can be if they want to, which is both a little terrifying and also, reassuring at the same time, of course. But I think that's one that they just absolutely dropped the ball on.
Yeah, and I mean, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe at least Facebook, if not the other platforms, the other big platforms, did try to crack down in the summer of 2020, but it didn't really sort of take hold, like you say, until sort of January, until after the insurrection. I guess sort of right action, wrong time, right action, just not fast enough. Is that essentially what you're saying?
That's essentially what I'm saying, because at that point, we had already seen people killed over this ideology, and various crimes being committed in its name. So I think the way it rolled out, it was like too reactive and it wasn't comprehensive. And a lot of it was a little too late. Even if people aren't, walking around with signs that say Q, or posting things that say Q, a lot of the ideology, this idea that there's, this nefarious network of, powerful people doing terrible things and trying to destroy the world, that's become more mainstream than ever in or I won't say ever, but it's become more mainstream than it has in recent history in the US, and we're still suffering the side effects of that.
I mean, you mentioned there the sort of real world violence, which, is probably gives us a big clue as to when social networks should start to pay attention to some of these movements, accounts, or hashtags. Look, until now, we've been talking about the sort of narrow version of deplatforming. The idea that you just take an account down, right? You delete it. Maybe you delete it forever, like President Trump, or maybe until the heat goes off or whatever, or your oversight board tells you otherwise. Obviously, social networks work in different ways. Deleting an account is not the only way to limit the spread of extremist ideas, far-right ideas. I am wondering if you've seen other solutions, perhaps even better solutions to this issue. JM, can I start with you?
Yeah, there are lots of potential strategies to use against bad actors on social media. So at the, permanent suspension is the most extreme. You can demonetize people. So, and we see that on YouTube a lot, because YouTube is a broadcasting platform in which people make money based on how many people watch their videos and how many ads are sold for their videos. So certain kinds of content are demonetized. It's an intermediate step that the platform uses, short of taking them offline, so that they're not raking in a ton of money off of, anti-Semitic content or conspiracy theory content. So, there are a lot of ways you can create friction. And we've seen some of them experimented on in the Trump era. We've seen, for instance, certain tweets by public figures were allowed to stay up, but they couldn't be retweeted. They couldn't be directly shared. There are various ways. What is usually referred to by people in the industry as creating friction. So you create friction for the user so they can't quite accomplish what they want to do. All of these solutions carry the same pitfalls that apply to deplatforming, to straight up deplatforming, which is that they're all, many of them are subjective. It's not clear when they're going to be applied, and they're not applied consistently across, geographic and cultural realms. So, because these companies are based in the United States and run by white, mostly male Americans, they treat things that happen in the United States differently than things that happen in Myanmar, and they treat things that happen in the United States differently than happen in the Middle East. So, there are definitely a range of options, and all of these options have some effect. Anytime you introduce friction, you do reduce the ability of bad actors to operate, but having this range of options doesn't kind of get around the big problems that we're still grappling with.
Jenny, I'd like to invite you to respond to what JM just said, and the idea that friction might stop the kinds of people you've been studying. Is that or any other potential way of limiting their amplification, their microphone on social media really viable?
Yeah, so I think I agree with James' points, and I do agree that introducing friction, especially before there is violence happening, could significantly help. I think that said, I still think that dominant social media companies operating abroad, especially in illiberal regimes and authoritarian regimes, should still consider how it should approach giving access to world leaders that have a track record of violating the human rights of its citizens. So I think this issue is still important, regardless of all the other tools and actually I think that deplatforming would not have been necessary, perhaps, before 2018, if friction were introduced as early as 2012, 2013, upon Facebook's entry into the market. One other challenge here is that when these horrible events happen in the US, you have the whole range of Facebook staff instinctively knowing what the problem is, or understanding what the facts, what the event is about, what the tragic event is about. But when this happens in other parts of the world, not just in Myanmar, but in other countries outside the US, that instinct is significantly reduced because you only have a limited number of people working on these countries. And this builds on to what JM said, and I think what Jared said about the PR. So social media companies have different incentives. And as what the other speakers have already mentioned, they usually act in order to save their image, their public image. And this actually has really bad effects in countries with authoritarian and illiberal regimes, where users, rights holders, are caught between a rock and a hard place. You have a bad government, and then you have a company that just doesn't care enough. So the question really here is, how can we promote democratic values in cyberspace on the platform globally?
Which is an excellent question. And I'd like to go to you, Emma, actually, who probably, I'm guessing you have a few thoughts about that.
Sure. Yeah. So one thing I wanted to say, building on what JM was talking about different approaches to introducing friction, is how from the outside of these companies, it is so hard to tell how effective any of these different tools or interventions actually are. And I think it's really good that companies are experimenting with different things. I think around the time of the US elections, Twitter was experimenting with warn people before they go to tweet something, a link to something that they haven't actually read or haven't clicked through on Twitter. They're coming up with really different creative ideas of trying to get people to stop and think before they post, before they share content. But from the outside, it's really hard to tell what effect any of these have. The companies can do and do in fact conduct internal research on how do these different tools and intervention work. But what I think we really need is a lot more ability for independent researchers to also gain access to data that social media companies have in order to be able to do independent research that evaluates the effects of these things or that look at questions that maybe the companies aren't focused on. There are potential significant privacy concerns with this, right? Like the concept of Cambridge Analytica probably just popped into a lot of people's heads because there's potentially some really significant risks to companies just offloading a whole bunch of user data into a private researcher's hands. But there are ways to approach doing research that protect individual privacy, but still allow for this kind of independent exploration of how effective any of these tools are. And at the same time, I think we really need a lot of transparency in how companies deploy these different friction methods. First and foremost, because when companies are opaque about things like de-emphasizing content's distribution in their algorithm or limiting features on an account that the account holder can see, but the general public looking at their account don't know about, it creates an environment for disinformation. It creates an environment for people to claim, even if it's not true, that they're being silenced by a platform, that a platform is trying to suppress their speech or reduce their reach or apply penalties that aren't fair. Sometimes that's absolutely what platforms are doing. They're applying penalties that aren't at all clear to their users, but sometimes they're not. And without that kind of transparency about policies and practices, it just creates a kind of total mess of a landscape for understanding what's actually happening, is it working to solve problems, and how can we address the mistakes the platforms make when they do enforce their policies.
We're going to go to questions in a minute because I know that a lot of you will have questions, so please put them in the Q&A box. I only had one small / big question. It's about sort of ideas for making this sort of decision making, these sorts of policies more democratic. Emma, you suggest research, and again, we go back to the transparency question of platforms being transparent. I know that for researchers, this is often a tricky, frustrating area. I will second that as a journalist. What we're actually dealing with is huge, powerful corporations, huge, powerful governments. Today, the British government announced that it would try to put through a bill called the Online Harms Bill, or perhaps the Online Safety Bill. We're not sure yet. Again, another sort of big government attempt to sort of rein in the social media companies. How do the rest of us feed into this whole system, this whole process? Are there any examples of sort of best practice from around the world? Emma, if you'd like to tackle that.
Oh, sorry, was that to me? Okay, yes. So I think it's, well, as far as feeding into legislative processes, I mean, it is really important that that when governments are considering legislation around how content moderation works, that they do things like have public hearings, solicit comments and feedback from the general public. There's such a dynamic right now around legislatures around the world wanting to really rein in big tech, that there's an important opportunity for getting things like transparency and accountability from social media companies and how they make these decisions. But there's also an enormous risk in kind of empowering governments to be able to actually restrict speech that they wouldn't be able to punish or prohibit directly through the mechanisms that they're trying to put in place around intermediaries. We're seeing a big push for filtering mandates in countries around the world, requirements that companies respond very quickly to notifications about, for example, terrorist propaganda in Europe, ideas that they have to respond to those notifications within an hour or face penalties under the law. That's an enormous incentive for companies to use automated filtering that is going to sweep in journalism and human rights advocacy and a lot of other content as well. So there, as much as it's kind of refreshing to see so many governments finally focused on issues of tech accountability and what privacy and transparency issues we need to solve with online platforms, there's also a big risk of kind of further empowering governments in a way that won't end well for people's free expression.
Yeah, you forgot to mention comedians. BBC Trending did a story about the NetzDG law in Germany, which when it was first enacted, drew in a whole load of comedians who were making sort of slightly, off-color jokes, misinterpreted, and found themselves falling afoul of social media rules. JM, what are your thoughts about that, and particularly sort of the transparency issue as a data access as a researcher?
So, yeah, I mean, I think the European law, the 1 hour law particularly, is a great example of how not to do this. Putting companies in a position where they have to make a determination whether content is rightfully removed in 1 hour is completely unreasonable. And there's no research basis really to suggest that an hour, removing it within an hour is a useful threshold. A lot of this discussion is based on a assumption by European researchers that if you take content down in the first hour, it's not going to spread as much. And so here, this brings us back kind of full circle to the transparency question. So far, there's no research to suggest that that's true. And the data that would allow us to assess whether that's true is not available to us in general, because the companies don't provide it. So, what you see in this space really is, people who watch the space will have noticed, I'm sure, that there's a tremendous amount of research about all this stuff on Twitter and not so much on YouTube and Facebook. And that's because Twitter's data API allows you to collect a lot of data that you can answer some of these questions about. Twitter is in many ways, it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's far more transparent than the other companies. And so a lot of what we understand about these dynamics is based on research on Twitter that may or may not apply to the other platforms. And so, really greater transparency, greater accountability are things that just absolutely have to happen. Now, there are legitimate privacy concerns for the companies in providing that access. In part because one of the things we learned from Twitter is that you can infer a tremendous amount about somebody based on things that they didn't post. You look at their posting activity and you look at who they follow, and you look at a lot of things they do that they do somewhat silently and may do with some expectation of privacy or anonymity, and you can use that data to find out things about them, which is the whole basis of the advertising ecosystem for these companies. So if it's one thing to sort of say, like, Facebook and YouTube should provide much more data about what their users are doing, but we also have to acknowledge that in doing so, they're going to create privacy concerns. So there's an element of catch-22 to this. So, this is a tough area. I think that we definitely need to move more toward transparency and accountability and to figure out how to navigate these other questions in that process. Right now, there's just too much that we're either assuming is true or that we are basing our assessment only on the dynamics that we see on Twitter.
Indeed. So look, I didn't think that we would really come to any conclusions or solve all the problems in this hour that we have. So it's probably just best to move to more questions. I'm going to start to scroll through some audience questions, and again, use the Q&A box on the side. Well, I'll try and get to as many of these as possible, but they are rolling in. Here's one from Steve Featherstone. And I think, Jared, you're probably best placed to speak to this. Can someone discuss the Boogaloo movement as a case study in deplatforming? I mean, I think that this is fascinating. Maybe you can just sort of take us through the Boogaloo movement's rise, its its platforming, and then its sort of dispersal and perhaps deplatforming. I'm not sort of up on the specific crackdown that Facebook or other companies have done about the Boogaloos, but tell us more.
Yeah, so the Boogaloo movement, generally speaking, because you always have to speak generally, otherwise someone will come and say, look, I found 3 Boogaloo accounts on Twitter today, and look, they're not gone. But generally speaking, this was something that a lot of tech platforms, I'm primarily thinking Twitter and Facebook, acted incredibly quickly about. And now I know in my research, whenever I'm like checking in on the Boogaloo groups, I have to go to some like very strange apps and weird places of the internet to find them. They've really been ejected quite forcefully into the fringes of the internet. And I think, January 17th, for example, that, a lot of us read reports about armed marches on state capitals. But what a lot of people don't know is that was a Boogaloo movement organized event. And I think the fact that it's so dispersed across these very kind of difficult or at the very least tedious places on the internet to get to really means that, even if they're calling for an event like that, the likelihood that they're going to be able to develop something at any sort of scale that would, provide what people were fearing at the time, which was another national security risk, is brought way down. And it speaks to what JM was saying about how deplatforming, even if it doesn't make people disappear off the internet forever or vanish, it can sometimes at least create enough friction there that it stops a group that is potentially very dangerous from being able to piece things together and go forward and cause harm.
I think that the next question I would like to give to Jenny, it's from Phil Reynolds, who says that since many of these companies enable repression by authoritarian regimes abroad, can they be trusted to be reliable censors in the US? I think this kind of gets to the point of, standards and rules of Silicon Valley applied. It's almost the reverse. So I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about whether the companies standards are really fit for purpose from one country to the other.
Well, I actually think that there are more safeguards for these platforms to be reliable in the US, precisely because the US is their home state. Any threat of regulation would force them to act more quickly and respond quickly, as we have in fact seen with respect to the January 6th insurrection. The bigger problem, in my view, is how these companies act outside of the US or in places where the government, there are bad state actors. And so I think that concern, and also what I said a while ago about the staff inside the platform itself, inside many of these companies, have more knowledge and familiarity with the US context than outside.
It's a fair point, I think. So look, I'm going to go to a question from Lena. Lena, I'm not going to try and say your last name. I'll just butcher it. But the question is, deplatforming will send people to a myriad of other spaces which will never deplatform. And of course, we know what we're talking about here, the Gabs and the Parlays and the 4chans of the world. Is that actually a safer scenario? JM, I expect you will have an opinion on that.
Yeah, well, a lot of my work has been on that. So, yes, we're never going to completely eradicate this stuff from the internet. In fact, we're never going to even completely eradicate it from Twitter and Facebook. What you're trying to do is reduce the harm, and so pushing people off of platforms where they can have massive audiences and millions of people and onto platforms that are smaller is a good step. And when these smaller platforms get to be big, they often end up coming under pressure to do more moderation. So we've seen that with Parler, for instance. Parler can't afford to stay online unless it does some moderation. If the cost of operation is too high. So if they're not making any effort to control the content on their platform, they're going to find it very hard to stay in business at scale. So, deplatforming is good at deplatforming. So it takes away a platform from people. It puts them in a position where they have to work harder for fewer views, fewer clicks. And, when the person that you're doing that to is a bad actor, then that's a net benefit, with the obvious caveat of all of the entire preceding hour of conversation to go on that as a cautionary tale. At the beginning of this, when I first started writing about this stuff, it was very controversial to say that deplatforming succeeded at deplatforming. And I actually had to write studies for about 10 years before people would accept the fact that, taking the people off these platforms actually had a negative effect on them. I think that we pretty much agree on that now. And so, if somebody has to go to roll their own social media app that it's a full-time job for them to do, cost them money, and they can only support 900 users, I'd say that's a win over them being on Twitter or Facebook.
Yeah, indeed. The next question I have is from Ben Grazda. Ben is a social media researcher at the LSE, right here in London. He's got a question for Jared. And it's this: how do you measure and then prevent the far-right spreading of disinfo and narratives that might not be outright violent, but continue to divide people who could then be aggravated to cause violence in certain circumstances? So I guess this is real crystal ball territory. If you can gaze into the future, where do you draw the line there?
I mean, yeah, that it's getting a little bit crystal ball territory. A lot of it would depend on the context, and it's hard to answer that with like a blanket, right? But generally, the way that I think about ideologies is in a way of like following them to their logical conclusions. So, like QAnon, for example, I would consider not a violent ideology in the way of like, we have to go out and commit murders or whatever, but the ideology being something that is incredibly inherently risky, because if you're following this idea that there's a network of world leaders that are abusing children and doing all kinds of terrible things, and it's in plain sight and nobody's doing anything, like when you make a true believer out of that sort of ideology, you have to think about like where it takes people. So that can be a bit more subjective. I'm afraid that I don't have a really objective way of looking at it. I have like my own thoughts about different ideologies and whatnot. But if we're going to think in terms of policy for the way that social media companies are thinking about it, we should have like differing perspectives or differing takes on ideologies. And that's why something I've said publicly is that I think social media companies would do well to develop in-house expertise on this stuff instead of looking out to reporters or disinformation researchers or trying to react to what's going outside. I think they benefit a lot from keeping some of this inside and maybe in the future being a bit more preventative.
I mean, for those of us who sort of like swim in these waters, I feel like we have a sense of the things that go big, the things that might be dangerous. but still, it's almost a sort of a gut thing. It's very difficult to sort of stack up evidence. Oh well, 1 million people used the QAnon hashtag, and clearly QAnon is talking about violent stuff, and thus violence will happen. It's just not that clear cut. I fear. JM, you got some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my research, both for my dissertation and in other work that I've done, is really focused on this question: is how can we draw lines that sort of are helpful in terms of these ideologies? And QAnon is actually, a particularly tricky case with respect to that. So there are two kind of basic arguments that I've been advancing as far as sort of understanding harmful ideologies. And the first is that extremism is a range of activities that doesn't begin and end with violence, because if you only take action against groups that are currently calling for violence, you're missing a lot of the picture of what happens in these movements. So we need to understand hostile action, harmful action, like, verbal harassment, as part of the spectrum of things that extremists do. And I think that, it's really important when we talk about sort of the range of possible actions that these companies can take. You can tune the action based on the kind of thing that this ideology is talking about. So the ideology is talking about shunning people. You take very low key action against them. Shunning is an extremist activity, but it's a very low level extremist activity. Whereas if they're talking about genocide, that's a very high level activity that should require a really high range of action. So QAnon is a particularly tricky test of this problem, because my argument is that we understand extremism as structural rather than based on the contents of the ideology. What I mean by that is that extremists have an in-group that is always calling for action against hostile action against an out-group, as sort of the structural understanding of how extremists function. QAnon, up until very recently, had the in-group, out-group formulation. There's the people who are good and the people who are bad, these Hollywood elites and political power pedophile people. But their entire belief structure was based on the idea that Donald Trump was secretly fighting and winning a war against these out-group. So you didn't have to do anything if you were in QAnon except cheer it on and try and figure out the mysteries and stuff. So with Donald Trump no longer president, and with it getting harder and harder for his fans to deny the fact that he's no longer president, the question is QAnon as a movement going to decide that it falls down to individual adherents to take action? So if Donald Trump's not successfully winning the secret war anymore, does the QAnon adherent have to pick up a gun and go kill some of these people? And that's the thing that we're worried about looking at this movement going forward. Some people in the movement have already taken that step on their own initiative, but it's not a key tenet of their ideology yet. So, when we sort of try and understand these progressive things and the evolution of these movements and the different kinds of steps we could take, we look at a movement like QAnon and we say, what should we do about this? Because it's got all the ingredients of an epic disaster, but it hasn't crossed that line yet.
Yeah. Absolutely. Look, I'll go to a question from a QAnon, excuse me, QAnon expert himself, my colleague Cheyenne from the BBC. Not a question about QAnon, but his question is more about the power of the social media companies themselves. And it boils down to basically whether any of us think that we're comfortable with the idea that a few senior executives of tech companies basically have so much power. And assuming that some of us are going to answer that question, no, not really. What can we practically do about it? I'll go to Emma first.
Sure. This is the key question, right? We see in the concentration of power that especially gigantic platforms like Facebook and YouTube have. It's an enormous power to potentially decide who gets a voice, who gets to have access to an audience, who can run a viable political campaign in a country. That's an enormous amount of power. The question is, who else should have that power? To me, I think the answer is actually getting back to something that looks a lot more like the original vision of the internet, which was many different services, many different places for people to post their speech, many different kinds of content policies that governed different sorts of services that weren't all trying to be all things to all people, the way a Facebook or a YouTube is. When you have that environment, you have the opportunity for a lot of different ideas to find a home somewhere, and you don't have the gigantic audiences that create such a risk when somebody starts doing something like inciting violence, that you might actually activate a very large group of people to go out and commit violence. The question is, how do we get there, right? Because the other potential answer is government decides what can be on Facebook or YouTube. And, they do in the laws that we have in the United States. We do have laws that ban certain kinds of speech. You can get sued for defamation. There are certain kinds of inciting speech that are prohibited by criminal law in the United States. But the First Amendment sets a very, very high bar to what government could actually restrict. So if we shifted the power as it exists right now from these companies to government, I think we'd actually see a lot less content moderation than we see today. We would see a lot less addressing of disinformation, which is typically in most forms not illegal in the United States. We would see a lot less ability to deal with things like pornography or low-level harassment that doesn't rise to the level of a criminal act, but is still really abusive and detrimental to users. So we are in this awkward space where the fact that private companies can go further than governments in what they decide to restrict on their particular slices of the internet, on their particular apps or services, is really helpful to actually creating potentially functional communication spaces online. You can have a site that has a focus on political speech and not doesn't support art or business reviews. You can have different kinds of places for different kinds of conversation. But the big challenge we have right now is because of kind of consolidation and a lack of competition, we're really feel stuck with just one or two major platforms.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with you for just a minute. There's a question that was asked by Stephen Ree. Would platforms welcome regulation that more clearly define what they can and can't do regarding content moderation? And how best could that regulation be drafted? Clearly a question that's been talked about a lot recently.
Yes, being hotly debated, certainly on both sides of the Atlantic right now. And if folks at least are living in the DC area, you will have seen lots of advertisements from Facebook specifically saying, we think the internet needs new regulation. So that platform at least apparently would welcome new regulations. I think one of the challenges that lawmakers are facing as they look at crafting new regulations is exactly these same line drawing questions. How do they define what is acceptable and not acceptable on different sorts of services? But there are a couple of key things I would look for in any kind of regulation of online content. One is, what's the underlying kind of intermediary liability law? This is going to be the law that sets out what happens when an online service, whether it's a web host or a search engine or an access provider, when they're informed that there is illegal content, that a judge has declared this content violates the law, what are they required to do? Receive a court order, take that content down. That's a crucial piece of the intermediary liability kind of legal framework that underpins all speech online. Because if companies face risks of potential liability themselves for user-generated content, they will clamp down more and more on user speech. They won't let people speak freely, to say controversial things, to hold some of those fringe views, because they worry about kind of facing legal consequence for that. So that's always going to be a core part of any regulation of online speech. But there are also a lot of discussions around, can we get more kind of transparency and due process in how content moderation happens? So sort of recognizing that what companies do with content moderation probably goes farther than what the law can restrict as far as substance, but there's still really important things like ensuring people are notified about the reason that their content was taken off of a platform, making sure they have an opportunity to appeal if they think that the company made the wrong decision or didn't apply their rules fairly, and getting transparency about what's going on, both in the form of kind of reporting about numbers, what rates are they having to reinstate content after appeal, things like that, but also just more information generally about their policies and practices so people can understand, when a service uses a ranking algorithm to put certain content in front of you, what kinds of values and ideas are feeding into that? How are those decisions being made? Because that's such a huge part of shaping people's online experience. The one thing I'll flag, big issue in all of this, is a lot of that sort of regulatory structure can make a lot of sense when we're thinking about companies the size of a Facebook or a Google. They do a lot of things along these lines already. There's a potential that we end up with regulations that are actually not too bad for a big Facebook or a Google to comply with, but absolutely destroy the ability for much smaller companies to compete with them, because it is in fact really expensive and requires a lot of person hours to put together something like a transparency report, to set up some of these different internal processes, to do content moderation and provide appeals at all. And so that's something I think we have to keep top of mind when we're talking about regulation, that we want whatever regulation comes to actually get us back towards that environment of lots of competition in the internet space, where you have lots of different services, lots of different options, and we need a regulatory framework that supports that, not hinders it.
I mean, that's just such a really interesting tension that is there. That it's not, it's very difficult to sort of square that circle. And it just strikes me, and I'd like to get Jenny's thoughts up here. Even the big companies have difficulty devoting resources, particularly when you look at all these places in the world. So, for instance, at one point there was only a handful of moderators in Facebook who spoke Burmese, and I'm not sure this was true until very recently, but you would see advertisements for a number of languages being advertised in Dublin to provide 24-hour cover around the world. However, you just have the sense that there are, particularly for some languages, not enough moderators, even on Facebook. Jenny, I'm just wondering, outside of the legal framework, whether you've seen this as an issue.
Yes, definitely. I see this as an issue. But I think that before a platform, like any other company, before it enters the market, it should assess whether it can uphold its corporate responsibility to respect the human rights of the people in that place where they operate. And I know you asked me a non-legal response, but actually I wanted to build on what Emma was saying a while ago about government regulation. And I wanted to use this opportunity to highlight that I think the US government, where many of these dominant social media platforms are situated, should also consider the global impact of domestic legislation applicable to American platforms. So we live in an interconnected world, and I think part of that is based on the legal architecture that allowed these platforms to flourish and operate outside of the US. So I think, for example, talks of Section 230 reform could be benefited by discussions on how this would affect users, both positively and maybe negatively, in other countries, because in turn that affects US foreign policy, as we have now seen in Myanmar. And by the way, I'm not blaming Facebook for the actions of the Myanmar military. These companies cannot save a country from bad state actors. But I do think that Facebook and other social media, or other companies for that matter, have a responsibility to respect human rights in places where they operate. And I think to answer your question again about going outside of the law, but more on the policy side, I think one response is to diversify the the people that work in companies, oversight boards, relevant multi-stakeholder initiatives that interpret and enforce content policies of social media platforms. And I think that would also include designing internal policies and processes. I'm not talking about content policies, but more like processes on deliberation or soliciting public comment. I think the design of these processes should think about at-risk populations that may not have the luxury or the time or the language fluency to submit a comment within, I don't know, 2 weeks or something. So I'm not, just to broaden the impact of these regulations globally.
In your work in Asia, do you see a country, a locality, a company, or a combination of those things where that sort of gets it right? Is there? I know a lot of people point to Taiwan. What are your thoughts?
Unfortunately, the most of the countries that I see are actually going in reverse. So, for example, Cambodia is pushing for a firewall the national internet gateway, which is like China's firewall. Myanmar is also replicating this. We also see this in the Philippines, where human rights activists and defenders are labeled as terrorists and communists, and months later they end up dead, shot or stabbed by unknown assailants. So unfortunately, I don't have a ready answer to that question.
I've mentioned Germany as a place that has quite unique laws that have a real impact. I'm just wondering if any of the other panelists have seen initiatives in other countries outside the U.S. that at least merit attention.
Well, yes, I can chime in and say, so Europe is very active in this, both at the member state level, in countries like Germany, the pending UK online harms legislation, as well as at the regional level with the Digital Services Act that Europe is considering, and the terrorist content regulation that they recently passed. Unfortunately, I would have to say from Europe, it's kind of a mixed bag. There is definitely a recognition of a desire to hold these companies accountable, make sure that they're respecting users' human rights. But we're also seeing ideas like, as JM and I were discussing earlier, the very short timeframes for responding to reports of illegal content. Looking at things like so-called trusted flaggers, which are groups and organizations and potentially sometimes law enforcement who get sort of priority treatment of the reports they send into companies. You can see the sorts of problems that might help solve, but it also can create a lot of problems. And even from the UK, we're seeing this idea of kind of online harms really potentially expanding the scope of what companies can be legally required to remove from their platforms, even though it might be lawful protected speech. So the idea that in addition to dealing with illegal content, there would be a legal requirement for companies to restrict what we're calling lawful but awful content, harmful content that may be legal but is, bullying or harassing or somehow, detrimental to users' experience. That's a really concerning idea because it really starts blurring this line completely between what the government can restrict through law, what companies might address through their terms of service, and starts putting enormous pressure on company to really allow less on their services in ways that we always see bear on already marginalized and disadvantaged voices.
Yeah. So I would the online harms bill is in some British journalist, I'm sure, is keeping a list of all the online harms that have been happening in the whole period of the debate of over the online harms bill, just going on for several years here, actually. Look, we're just about out of time. It's fascinating stuff. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for your questions as well. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them, but we got through a fair chunk, so I'm really glad about that. I'm going to hand over now to Tom Warwick. Take it away, Tom. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm Tom Warwick, the director of the Atlantic Council's Future of DHS project, where we're studying how to protect American democracy from a broad range of non-military threats, including terrorism, whether international, like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or domestic, like white supremacists who've attacked houses of worship and shopping malls here in the United States. And of course, there was the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. In summing up today's discussion, I'd like to make 5 points. First, as J.M. Berger said, deplatforming works at taking away a platform for violent extremists. The experience with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS have shown this and shown that it can be effective. Deplatforming actually has a longer history than many people realize. In many ways, it goes back to the 1980s and the development of computer bulletin board systems and online chat groups. Online communities, in order to work, need to be run by different rules than public squares or a world where the best mass communication tool was a newspaper, as it was when the Constitution and the First Amendment was written. For example, the tools that a government is allowed to use to keep order in public spaces are not available in online spaces, especially where the online space is privately held by private entities who try to earn legitimate returns for their shareholders. The novelty of the situation means that there hasn't been time in American society, let alone in democratic societies generally, for there to be a societal consensus that led to the First Amendment in the United States and comparable protections for free speech and public order in other countries. So what we're left with is a system where there were rules that applied to governments, but not so much to private media companies like social media companies who dominate the space that we're talking about here. As a thought experiment, you could simply think about what would happen, as indeed several of our speakers have alluded to, if governments ran social media and everything had to be posted on a government website. And you can see how different the world would be, and a discussion like this might exist. Second, as those of us who've worked in Homeland Security know, what disrupts the plots of violent extremists is good for the rest of the society who wants to live peaceably, securely, and with their rights respected. Deplatforming and the use of friction, as several of our panelists described it, use a similar rule to what the Department of Homeland Security and other security services have used to effectively disrupt terrorist travel. Keeping bad actors off of airplanes forces them to use slower means of travel. Keeping them off the highways slows them down still further, and so on, creating more opportunities for violent plots to be detected, located, and if necessary, disrupted. I haven't heard this described as friction, as our panelists described it here in the online space, but we can recognize that there are places where friction can serve an important purpose. Third, there is a moral hazard, as several of our panelists noted, associated with interfering with the free exchange of ideas. Advocates of deplatforming of violent extremists need to acknowledge this. There's a particular moral hazard in the United States because of the First Amendment. The United States differs from other democracies like the United Kingdom or Germany that have a different set of rules for reasons that reflect the constitutional, political, and social history of those countries. There is, I would suggest, no universal rule that applies in all countries and at all times. In the United States, there's a bright line associated with crossing the line from constitutionally protected speech, which is legal, into violence, which is not. The bright line of violence, which separates free speech from conduct that is criminal, is an integral part of the American sense of what is fair and just. And this plays an important role in understanding the debate over deplatforming here in the United States. It can be otherwise in democracies like the United Kingdom or Germany. It also, as we've heard, as Jenny rightly reminded us, plays a totally different role in authoritarian societies, and trying to have the same rules applied by social media companies in countries like China compared with countries like the United States, United Kingdom, or Germany is actually a discussion that needs to be had, because there's no logical reason to assume that that should be the case, as is done in certain other areas of the law. My fourth point is deplatforming is not without its risks. Several of the people asking questions raised the point about whether deplatforming drives people underground. Law enforcement will tell you they'd rather have them there than out above ground in many cases. But one of the more important risks that we need to understand better is actually the way that standards are being developed. Standards like proportionality, which several of our speakers have mentioned, need to be developed, discussed, and then ultimately applied. As Emma mentioned towards the end of the discussion, notice an opportunity to be heard, which is a phrase that rule of law advocates will recognize as central to the entire concept of rule of law, ought to be included in the standards of when deplatforming is enforced. However, there is no legislature, there is no parliament where social media companies and their users debate or discuss this. There are the actual parliaments, the actual houses of Congress, Parliament, and similar places around the world. But those don't actually have the same authority over social media, which tends to move faster and more freely. But what this means is that in the absence of a continuous formal legislative process, what will end up happening is a more common law approach, referring to a system when judges in 15th, 16th, and 17th century England developed rules and applied them to specific cases, and people built up an understanding of those rules over time. Now, those rules, the common law, can be criticized for entrenching a power structure that had to be changed over time in some ways, often more slowly than it needed to. And it's worth thinking about the ways in which rules entrench power structures in ways that are unintended or undesirable. Here's where social media companies sharing data with the public, transparency, can actually inform a vigorous public debate that needs to take place about what the standards are and what the rules and conditions under which deplatforming and similar actions can take place. In this respect, the Facebook Oversight Board's admonition to the company that engaged them is one of the most important contributions to the debate. Rules need to be discussed and developed, and there needs to be a public debate that is informed in ways that are important, especially when, as here, key parts of the underlying data are in private hands. Fifth and finally, I would note that the events of the last several years, with the way Al-Qaeda and ISIS have operated, and with events here in the United States, should have demonstrated to all of us that democracy and open and secure societies are more fragile than many of us would have thought in our lifetimes. This is why the series After the Insurrection here at the Atlantic Council is important, as are similar discussions taking place in other think tanks, not just in Washington and the United States, but around the world. These are some of the most important issues facing democratic societies. So we thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at our next session as we discuss another aspect of the implications of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol for American democracy and for other democratic societies. Let me say thank you to our panelists, J.M. Berger, Jared Holt, Emma Alonso, Jenny Domino. A special thanks to Jenny, who's 6 hours ahead of the rest of us here on the East Coast of the United States, and to our moderator, Mike Windling, only 5 hours ahead. And thanks also to Emerson Brooking for his introductions. Thank you for coming. We look forward to seeing you again later this month.